This Palestinian village of Sebastia lies on the eastern side of the ruins of the ancient site of Samaria, also known as Sebaste. The region's shallow valleys provide easy access routes into the eastern higher hills. In the Old Testament, this was the western allocation of the tribe of Manasseh. The region receives plentiful rain, and in antiquity was tree-covered and well cultivated. The camera flies east to west along the southern side of the ancient ruins of Samaria. In the 9th century BC, the Israelite king Omri purchased and fortified the hill. He named it Samaria, and it was the capital of the northern kingdom until the Assyrians defeated Israel around 720 BC. On a hill rising over 300 feet above the surrounding valleys, it was strategically located near crossroads of major highways. Easily defended, it later became an important Hellenistic and then Roman city. Herod the Great rebuilt the city about the time of Christ and renamed it Sebaste. Excavations have revealed Samaria and Sebaste were wealthy. The bus moving down the hill has just passed between massive round Hellenistic towers built about 300 BC. These towers guarded the western entrance to the city. The helicopter circles over the ruins of Sebaste's ancient forum, built by Herod the Great about 25 BC, and a basilica. The forum is the large area farthest from the red-roofed building, with remains of columns. It is about 425 feet long and 240 feet wide, and originally surrounded by 24 columns. The forum was the central market area, used for commerce, courts, and public discourse. The basilica is at the end of the forum, nearest the red-roofed building. The clip ends with a close look at the remains of the basilica and a semicircular niche and benches in the nave. The camera follows along the major roadway that went through the city of Samaria and Sebaste, generally where the modern road is seen. This was the city's Cardo, a colonnaded street built by Herod the Great about 25 BC and rebuilt several more times. Some 600 columns were erected along the street over a distance of about a half a mile. The Cardo was over 36 feet wide. Columns stood on each side of the street, supporting a roofed portico, under which shops of all kinds were built. Above the street and to the right was a residential area. As the Cardo approaches the western gate, two huge round towers, over 45 feet in diameter, that protected the city's entrance, come into view. The foundations of the towers were first constructed in the 1st or 2nd century BC, but the remains of the towers date to the time of Herod the Great. Flying over the mound of ancient Samaria, the camera zooms in on the ruins of a small church, the Church of St. John the Baptist. It dates to about AD 1150, but its foundations date to the 6th century. Although the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus reports John the Baptist was executed at Machaerus near the Dead Sea, the earliest Christian traditions place John's tomb here at Sebaste. Next, the helicopter circles over the 9th century BC foundation and walls of the magnificent palace of Omri and Ahab. The larger square stones and steps mark the remains of a small temple constructed later by Herod the Great. Herod dedicated this temple to his patron, Caesar Augustus. Augustus's Greek name was Sebastos, and it was his name that provided the root for the name of the city, Sebaste. At the northern end of the Acropolis of ancient Samaria, later called Sebaste, a theater comes into view. The theater as seen here is from the early 3rd century AD. However, there is evidence that an earlier theater was also here. Built into the side of the hill, its style is indicative of the Greek period. Behind and just to the left of the theater are the remains of a 4th century BC circular tower. Archaeologists describe this tower as one of the finest examples of the Hellenistic period architecture in the country. It sits astride a much earlier Israelite wall that had to be breached for its insertion. In the time of Alexander the Great, the tower connected to a later wall system that protected the summit of the hill. The helicopter circles the summit of Mount Ebal that was in the western territory given to the tribe of Manasseh. This mountain, over 2,600 feet above sea level, was in the divided kingdom of Israel, and in Jesus' day, the region called Samaria. The Old Testament reports that Joshua built an altar somewhere on this mountain to commemorate Israel's entrance into the land. As the helicopter turns, a large valley and city south of the mountain come into view. To the left, the valley leads down into the Jordan Valley. Mount Gerizim is the hill seen on the other side of the valley. On the slopes of Mount Gerizim are the outskirts of the city of Nablus that occupies the valley floor. In the foreground, on the brown excavated hilltop, are the remains of a worship site on Mount Gerizim in Samaria. This place is referred to by the woman at the well, where Jesus announced his messiahship in the 4th chapter of John. Coming into view on the upper right is a large valley, and across the valley to the north is Mount Ebal. In between these two high hills is the modern city of Nablus, built near and over the ruins of ancient Shechem and Sychar. It was here that God promised Abraham, "To your descendants I will give this land." Here, the camera takes a closer look at the excavations on the summit of Mount Gerizim. Mount Ebal is in the distance. As the helicopter circles, the ruins of an octagonal Byzantine church constructed over the earlier Samaritan temple of Jesus' day is seen. Jacob sojourned in the vicinity of Shechem, and Joseph was buried there. After the Israelites entered Canaan, they came here to read the blessings and curses from the slopes of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Along the ridge, adjacent to the ruins, is a modern Samaritan village, whose residents retain many of the traditions of their biblical ancestors. This area of Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, and the city in between, Shechem, has played an important role throughout the Bible, from the time of Abraham in the Old Testament through Jesus' announcement of his coming in the New. We are circling above the excavation of the biblical city of Shechem. Thin lines at the top of the excavation mark a portion of the ancient city's parallel walls. This unique ground-level clip begins with a view of Mount Ebal and turns to the tell, or mound, that are some of the ruins of ancient Shechem. In the foreground is a wall line, and behind it, a rectangular foundation of a temple. We look east toward the Jordan Valley as the camera returns to where it began. This small 7.5-acre hill on which the square tower stands is in the territory given to the tribe of Ephraim. It is the location of biblical Shiloh. The Bible records that under Joshua's leadership, the tabernacle was set up at Shiloh. Here the land was divided among the tribes and the Levitical cities distributed. During the period of the Judges, the young boy Samuel was brought to Shiloh by his mother to be raised under the priest Eli. It was from here that the Ark of the Covenant was taken to the battlefield at Aphek, only to be captured by the Philistines in one of Israel's darkest hours. The helicopter flies close to the north end of the tell, or mound, that was the ancient site of Shiloh. Danish and Israeli archaeologists have excavated significant portions of the site and determined it was occupied during most of the Old Testament period. The flat area on the shoulder of the hill over which the helicopter is flying approximates the size of the tabernacle, which the Bible says was placed somewhere in Shiloh after the Israelites entered the land. Surrounding Shiloh are the rugged limestone hills of central Samaria, and the road seen winding through the valley follows the ancient route that ran from Jerusalem to Shechem. The hill country seen here is a term that refers to the mountainous central region of Judea and Samaria. It is rugged terrain with steep hillsides and deep east-west V-shaped valleys. In Old Testament times, it was heavily forested, and much of early Israel's history took place in this region. The steep valleys confined north-south traffic to a road along the watershed, a route taken by Abraham and the patriarchs. The rugged and forested hills provided protection from invading armies that marched along the coastal plains. Following the conquest, some of the Israelite tribes remained in the hill country rather than move to their assigned territories nearer the coast. Joseph had to travel from Nazareth to his hometown of Bethlehem in Judah in order to register for a census. Mary, who was about to give birth to Jesus, accompanied him. Bethlehem is about 6 miles south of Jerusalem, in the hill country. The ancient village was located in the vicinity of the church complex seen in the center of the screen. Located along a rocky ridge, residents built their homes using caves as a subfloor or basement in which to stable their livestock. Tradition holds that it was in such a cave that Jesus was born. The fields that surround Bethlehem can be seen. In these fields, wheat is grown and livestock grazed. Ruth, of the ancestry of Jesus, met her future husband Boaz in these grain fields. King David, as a young man, watched over his father's flocks near here. It was in these fields that the angels appeared to shepherds to announce the birth of Messiah, Jesus, as prophesied by the prophet Micah. The helicopter circles grain fields near Bethlehem. On the skyline, in the far distance, can be seen some buildings of Jerusalem, about 6 miles north. This area has traditionally been called Shepherd's Field and is a half a mile east of Bethlehem, adjacent to the Palestinian village of Bet-She'er. From as early as the 4th century, the area has been venerated as the location where angels telling of Jesus' birth in nearby Bethlehem appeared to shepherds. The red-roofed buildings are located within the property of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. Excavations in the compound reveal remains of 4th to 6th century church structures, commemorating the announcement of Jesus' birth to the shepherds who were caring for sheep in these fields. The modern church is built over a natural cave that has a beautiful mosaic floor. The clip ends with the barren hills in the background that marks the edge of the wilderness of Judea that runs between here and the Dead Sea. The cone-shaped hill is the Herodion, a remarkable fortified palace and mausoleum built by Herod the Great about 20 B.C. He moved dirt from the top of a nearby hill and with it surrounded the lower levels of a circular fort he constructed. From here, Herod could quickly escape if attacked by any of his enemies. Herod's extravagance is seen in this palace complex, built for his friends to use at the base of the hill. The sunken square area is a huge pool, almost 10 feet deep, 150 feet wide, and 250 feet long. It was surrounded by a colonnaded garden. The circular pavilion in the center reveals that this was not just a reservoir, but was designed to be architecturally lovely and serve as well as a swimming pool and small marina. Since the area is obviously arid, water was brought via an aqueduct from over 3.5 miles away. Herod constructed this remarkable cone-shaped fort in the Judean wilderness near a canyon, the Wadi Tekoa seen in the background, which would permit him to escape the area if attacked. Originally, the outer walls of this fort rose several stories above the earth fill. Visible around the cone are defensive towers built into the wall at each point of the compass. Inside the volcano-like mouth, Herod constructed a palatial mansion with all the amenities of the finest Roman estates, including a water system, bathhouse, and a columned garden. Between the walls on several floors were bedrooms for his family and guests. This well-designed fort and palace symbolized Herod's concern for security. However, his greatest threat was a baby, born in a cave stable 3 miles away, in an insignificant village named Bethlehem. Herod the Great built a large building and high walls that enclosed the traditional site of the Cave of Machpelah, a place purchased by Abraham to be the tomb for Sarah, his wife. Machpelah is the city of Hebron. Machpelah was also the burial location for Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah. The Bible names this site Kiriath Arba and Mamre, and the city is mentioned more than 60 times in the Old Testament. Jacob dispatched Joseph from Hebron to find his brothers. David settled here after Saul died. At Hebron, the elders of Israel proclaimed David king over all Israel. This harsh area is a portion of the Judean wilderness, the traditional location of Jesus' temptations. Geographically, the wilderness is a rectangular strip of land, about 60 miles long and 10 miles wide, that extends between the Judean hills near Jerusalem on the west to the Jordan River Valley, Jericho and the Dead Sea on the east. Although appearing desolate, it is not uninhabited, as can be seen from the occasional shepherds and their flocks. At about 2,700 feet above sea level, the land descends almost 4,000 feet in a series of narrow gorges and steep chalky cliffs to the valley floor, where, at the Dead Sea, it is 1,300 feet below sea level. The helicopter is now flying east, and in the distance is the Jordan Valley, and barely discernible in the mist of the distance is the north end of the Dead Sea, with the mountains of Moab on the horizon. The helicopter flies west through a canyon or wadi in Arabic called the Wadi Kelt. The wadi begins east of Jerusalem at 2,600 feet above sea level and goes to New Testament Jericho at 800 feet below sea level. This arid area only receives rain for a few winter months. As a result, rainwater is collected by the normally dry wadi, and then it drains into the Jordan Valley. Thus, there is a short season in which grass grows in the wilderness that shepherds use to graze their flocks. Passing over a Bedouin encampment, we see on the left a 2nd century A.D. Hasmonean water aqueduct that moved waters from higher in the gorge down to Jericho. Hikers now follow this route to trek down to the Jordan Valley. Not visible atop the ridge to the right is an ancient Roman road from Jerusalem to Jericho. That road and this area is the scene for Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan. This clip begins with a helicopter flying east through a section of the Wadi Kelt, a canyon system that begins east of Jerusalem and exits in the Jordan Valley near New Testament Jericho. The helicopter then turns to fly over the precipitous cliffs that rise for hundreds of feet on the south side of the gorge. As the helicopter circles and crests the hill, a black-topped road comes into view, the ancient Roman road that went from Jerusalem to Jericho. This remote track is the scene Jesus used for his teaching of the Good Samaritan. Flying over the bus, the helicopter turns north and again flies down into the gorge. The camera follows a paved walking trail that pilgrims and others use to trek into the canyon or visit a Greek Orthodox monastery that clings to the north face of the wadi. The monastery of St. George was rebuilt in the late 19th century A.D. over an earlier 5th century Byzantine monastery. In the face of the cliff are seen numerous caves that have served as homes to ascetic hermits and monks. Flying along the north side of the Wadi Kelt, the camera provides a view of the Jordan Valley in the distance. On the right, near the exit of the canyon, is a prominent flat-topped peak that is the location of Kypros. This fort, named after Herod the Great's mother, was one of many Herod constructed to protect his kingdom from invasion. The fortress overlooked New Testament Jericho and guarded the Roman road from Jerusalem. Along the sides of the canyon can be seen channels that bring water from springs further west in the canyon down to the Jordan Valley. The gorge has biblical significance, for it is commonly believed that this is the valley of Achor, mentioned in Joshua chapter 7, verse 10. In this gorge, the man Achan was stoned because he disobeyed the order of the Lord not to keep items of value taken during the capture of Jericho. The 10-acre ruin of Old Testament Jericho is seen in this clip. The Tell, or mound, is about 9 miles north of the Dead Sea and is 875 feet below sea level. It has been extensively excavated, and archaeologists have concluded that Jericho is the oldest fortified city in the world, with evidence of settlement going back some 10,000 years. The hills of the Judean wilderness and hill country are seen in the background. People settled at this oasis because of a copious spring, later called Elisha Spring, located on the near side of the mound next to the road and the red-roofed building. When the Israelites and Joshua approached the city of Jericho, it was protected by high walls. Coming into view at the bottom of the screen, in the freshly excavated area above the green bushes, are the remains of about 50 feet of an outer wall that surrounded the city in Joshua's day. Jericho's defeat was essential in order for the Israelites to leave the Jordan Valley and advance up into the hill country. The clip begins with a brief look at the irrigated Jordan Valley, and then the helicopter swings west to view the cliffs that delimit the eastern edge of the Judean wilderness above. Small structures that overlook the Jordan Valley and Jericho and built on the sides of the cliff over caves come into view. These belong to Der Kuratul, a Greek Orthodox monastery. The present buildings are only 100 or so years old, but the caves under the buildings have been occupied by monks and hermits for many centuries. The helicopter flies over the summit of a mountain, popularly known as the Mount of Temptation, that overlooks the Jordan Valley. Another name for the mountain is Quarantine, the root of which is a corruption of the Latin quarant, meaning 40. This reminds us of the 40 days of Jesus' wilderness experience and temptation. The first monks arrived here in the 4th century, and soon a church was built. Crusaders rebuilt the structures in the 12th century. Later, Greeks came into possession of the mountain, and instead of constructing a church on the summit, built a monastery and church on the sheer sides of cliff below. The visible ruins seen here are mostly from the Byzantine and medieval periods. Here, in the wilderness of Judah, is the mosque and multi-domed building complex of Nebi Musa. It is an Islamic shrine, one of several sites that Islamic tradition remembers as the burial place of Moses. This, in spite of the fact that the Bible states Moses was not permitted to cross the Jordan and that no one knows his place of burial. But according to the Muslims, his body was carried across the river to be buried here in the Promised Land. The shrine is a lovely location with a marvelous view. It was constructed in the Mamluk period, around AD 1265. Originally, its function was to be a fortress and way station for Islamic pilgrims on their journeys and pilgrimages to Jerusalem. The imposing Hasmonean fortress of Herconia, now known as Khirbet Mird, occupies this elongated hilltop in the foreboding Judean wilderness, 9 miles southeast of Jerusalem, 7 miles west of the Dead Sea, and 800 feet above sea level. Herod the Great captured this fortress, first built by John Hyrcanus and the source of the fort's original name, in 31 B.C. Herod used it to imprison and here executed political adversaries. After Herod's death, the site fell into disuse until a monastery was built here in the 5th century. It remained occupied until finally abandoned in the 14th century. The wall surrounding the summit is modern. There were large cisterns here that held an estimated 16,000 cubic meters of water. Herod constructed the aqueducts to supply the cisterns, and the remains of the aqueducts can be seen at the base of the hill as the helicopter completes its circle. Here, in the Judean wilderness, is the imposing monastery of Mar Saba. It is 7.5 miles east of Bethlehem and seemingly hangs to the slope of a steep gorge that is the eastern end of the Kidron Valley that begins near Jerusalem. The present-day Greek Orthodox monastery was constructed in 1840 over caves and other structures first built by Saint Sabas, who lived in the 5th century. Saba's sanctity attracted other monks, and by the beginning of the 6th century, the area had a hospital, bakery, water reservoirs, a very large church, and served as the center for between 250 to 300 monks. Throughout history, many of the men who lived here were attacked and murdered. The present buildings were constructed for protection. This ascetic location reminds visitors of how Christendom has produced many penitents and martyrs, as well as writers and saints, some of whom lived and worshipped here. Looking north from the plain along the Dead Sea, the helicopter turns west, and the marl terraces and eastern cliffs of the Judean wilderness come into view. A cave can be seen that is only a small black hole in the side of the cliff at the center of the left side of the screen. This is the so-called Cave 1, where in 1947, Bedouin shepherds first discovered fragments of 7 ancient documents that later have come to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Their discovery began a search for more of the ancient documents by archaeologists and others in the numerous natural caves that honeycomb the cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. These are the archaeological excavations of Qumran, located about a half-mile southeast of the caves that produced the original Dead Sea Scrolls. The settlement here, near the shore of the Dead Sea, is thought to be associated with a religious community of the 1st century, the Essenes. After flying over the excavations, the camera turns its attention to caves that can be seen on the upper parts of a cliff over the ravine. In 1952, Bedouins discovered more fragments and documents here in these caves. Thus far, the fragments of about 200 biblical scrolls have been found in the caves, north and south of Qumran. Every book in the Hebrew Bible, except for Esther, appears among the Qumran caches. Previously, scholars did not have a document in Hebrew of any biblical book dating before the medieval period. Interestingly, these ancient manuscripts are in substantial agreement with contemporary biblical texts. This area of green vegetation is Ian Fesca, an area of brackish springs along the northwestern shoreline of the Dead Sea, some 2 miles south of Qumran. Excavations have revealed a Jewish settlement lived here around the time of Jesus, and archaeologists believe the residents were farmers who were part of the religious sect that lived at Qumran. This group had detached itself from official Judaism and led a separate existence here in the desert. In the 1st century, they were absorbed in labor, and they prayed for the coming Messiah. Meanwhile, the true Savior Messiah, the one for whom they awaited, lived and taught only a few miles away. The helicopter flies over the rim of the cliffs that mark the western side of the Dead Sea. Turning north, the bleak and forbidding terrain along the coast is seen. This perspective makes clear that the cliffs of the Judean desert, averaging about 1,000 feet above the Dead Sea, come almost to the edge of the water. The Dead Sea is the lowest point on Earth, at more than 1,200 feet below sea level, with 25 to 30% salinity. That makes it the saltiest natural body of water in the world. While looking at this arid desert region, one can imagine John the Baptist calling out, "Make ready the way of the Lord, make his path straight." This is the region known in the Bible as En Gedi, or Spring of the Wild Goat, and is located on the west shore of the Dead Sea, about 20 miles south of Qumran. If you were to walk up the large canyon in the background, you would find it leads to a point near Bethlehem. An ancient route paralleled this canyon and was called the Wilderness of Ziz. It connected the Dead Sea to the area around Bethlehem. Dotting the canyon's walls are many caves and some lovely, refreshing waterfalls. Here, the Bible records David and his small army hid from King Saul, who was seeking David's life. The green vegetation on the plateau in the foreground is a modern Israeli agricultural community. Archaeological excavations here have revealed that the area has a long history of occupation, most notably during the Hasmonean and Roman periods. The helicopter flies around a remarkable fortress built by Herod the Great. It is constructed on a diamond-shaped mesa at the eastern edge of the Judean desert and on the western shore of the Dead Sea that is clearly visible in the background. The mountain soars over 1,300 feet above the Dead Sea. Herod enclosed the summit with a double wall with 4 gates, 70 rooms, and 30 towers, in spite of the fact that the sheer cliffs of the mountain adequately protected the summit from attack. A naturally barren and dry region, Herod built aqueducts and cisterns to supply fresh water for the bathhouses and pools of his 4 palace complexes on the top of the mountain. The most famous palace is the northern one, created in 3 tiers, seemingly hanging off the edge of the cliff. The profile of this 3-level palace can be clearly discerned here. Masada is not mentioned in the Bible, but this place provides a study of King Herod's megalomania and anxiety. His insecurity is exemplified in the design and need for this massive structure. But the birth of the real King of the Jews, Jesus Christ, presented Herod with a threat against which no fortress could defend. In the foreground is a Roman encampment overlooking, across the ravine, the diamond-shaped fortress of Masada, built by Herod the Great. During the first Jewish revolt in AD 66, the mountaintop was occupied by zealots. The Roman 10th Legion surrounded the mountain and besieged the Jewish defenders. The zealots held out for many months. The Romans finally constructed a huge siege ramp, the remains of which can be seen in the shadow on the left side of the mountain. The ramp went from the base of the mountain to the top, an ascent of over 1,000 feet. On the night prior to the final assault, the Jewish defenders committed suicide rather than submit to Roman defeat. Flying north along the western shoreline of the shallow southern bay of the Dead Sea, the camera looks across the 10-mile expanse of water towards the mountains of Moab in the distance. Many archaeologists believe that the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah may have been at the foot of those mountains. In ancient times, this area, now flooded by the Dead Sea, was a plateau and irrigated by fresh water flowing down from the mountains. As the sea has no exit, water is lost only through evaporation that can be as much as 9 inches a day in the stifling heat and low altitude of the region. The sea rests in a geological depression, the deepest in the world, and is over a naturally occurring salt dome. As a result, the waters are rich in minerals, and today those chemicals are mined by retaining the water in large evaporative ponds. After the water evaporates, the chemicals are gathered for many different commercial purposes.